I believe that Judge Rozier may have a couple of questions for this witness.
Yes, thank you. Dr. or Professor Callanan, just a couple of questions. First, just referencing your time taking a look at the other states that have some form of voter identification, I was curious as to whether or not you were able to determine whether any of those states had their laws implemented following the passage of some sort of constitutional amendment, as we've had here in North Carolina.
Your Honor, it's a good question. I don't know the answer, whether there was any antecedent constitutional amendment in the other states.
All right, thank you. That's quick enough. That's an answer. The only other subject, maybe just one question, would be following this recent 2020 election, whether or not there are any new updated studies that you've seen regarding voter confidence, particularly in states where there already was some form of photographic voter identification, like in Georgia.
Your Honor, that's a very good question. I wish social science moved so quickly as to have a result regarding 2020. If I were to connect 2020 to the findings in the report myself, I would just say that you have an illustration in 2020 of some of the ill effects that political scientists have found associated with voters doubting the integrity of an election result.
All right, and you would extend that to states where there already is some sort of form of voter identification?
Your Honor, I mean to say that it's not surprising to a political scientist to find that a group of Americans who have low trust in election integrity might find that there might be ill effects that follow from that low trust.
Okay, all right, thank you. Those are my questions.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Are there any other questions from counsel for any of the parties as a follow-up to any questions asked from the court?
Not from legislative defendants, Your Honor.
Not from the state defendants.
And not from the plaintiffs, Your Honor.
All right, Professor Callanan, thank you very much for your testimony. You are now free to leave the virtual courtroom. I appreciate you being here, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Who will be the legislative defendant's next witness?
Your Honor, we will be calling Professor Trey Hood, and Ms. Moss will be handling the direct examination.
All right, and we could go ahead and let in Mr. Hood to the courtroom. Who will be examining this witness on behalf of the plaintiff?
Your Honor, on behalf of plaintiffs, David Giller will be conducting the cross-examination.
And how about the state defendant?
Paul Cox, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Hood, can you hear me? Is Trey Hood in the courtroom?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you hear me, Mr. Hood?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
I can. Yes, sir. I can now. If you would please, sir, can you raise your right hand?
Do you need me to stand up?
No, you can stay seated. Madam Clerk.
Do you solemnly affirm that your testimony to the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and this is your solemn affirmation?
I do.
Thank you. You can lower your hand.
Ms. Moss, you may examine the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Professor Hood. Could you please state your full name for the record?
M.V. Hood III.
Great. Professor Hood, what is your current position?
Currently, I'm a professor of political science and a director of the SPIA Survey Research Center at the University of Georgia.
And how long have you been with the University of Georgia?
Since August of 1999.
Please tell the court a bit about your academic background, please.
Sure. I have 3 degrees in political science, a BS in political science from Texas A&M, an MA in political science from Baylor University, and a PhD from Texas Tech.
And within the broad field of political science, are there any areas in which you have specialized?
Well, broadly, I study American politics and policy. More specifically, I study within that framework, if you will, Southern politics, election administration, electoral politics, racial politics. I think that encompasses most of it.
And you indicated that you've been at the University of Georgia since 1999. Have you held any other positions since completing your PhD?
I was a visiting assistant professor for 2 years at Texas Tech University, but since then I've been at the University of Georgia.
And since your time at the University of Georgia, have you taught graduate or undergraduate courses in the field of political science?
Yes, both.
Okay, and can you tell us some of the representative courses that you have taught?
At the undergraduate level, I've taught courses in the past in research methodology. I teach every year, every spring, I teach a course in Southern politics, which has a heavy dose of voting rights sort of injected into it. I've taught, that's at the undergraduate level. I've taught Southern politics at the graduate level, and I've taught a course in election administration a couple of times at the graduate level.
And since obtaining your PhD, have you done any research into any topics?
Yes. So research and teaching have a heavy overlap for me. I conduct research in the area of Southern politics, which is a pretty expansive area that covers a lot, as well as election administration. So those are my 2 major areas of focus, I guess you could say.
And to what extent does your academic work in training include examining and evaluating empirical studies and statistical models?
Well, I mean, it's something I'm perpetually doing, I guess you could say. I'm either looking at what someone else has done or formulating my own models to test. And again, that's part of what I do is research at the university. So I have published a number of articles specifically in the area of election administration, and specifically in the area of voter ID within that. So, but research is something I'm very involved with.
And the articles that you mentioned having published on election administration and voter ID, were those published in peer-reviewed journals?
Yes.
And approximately how many peer-reviewed articles on those topics have you published?
I don't know exactly on those topics. I've published more than 50 peer-reviewed articles at this point. I would say, more than 10 conservatively within the election, within the area of election administration. I published a couple of peer-reviewed books. So, I mean, I did affix a copy of my Vita to the expert report.
And is that Vita a fairly accurate representation of your expertise and qualifications?
Certainly at the time when I submitted the report, it was up to date. There may be a few additions since that point in time. But at the time, it certainly was up to date.
And have you served on the editorial boards of any academic journals?
I currently serve on 2 editorial boards, one Social Science Quarterly, and the second journal is Election Law, the Election Law Journal. And the second journal is, deals specifically with the area of election administration for one thing. So.
Have you received any awards for your research in your areas of study?
I've received one award related to an article I published in a particular journal. I believe, well, I'd have to look in my Vita at this point. I don't want to misstate the name of the award, but I've also received external research funding specifically to study issues related to election administration from the National Science Foundation, from the Center for Election Innovation and Research, from the Pew Charitable Trust.
Have you testified as an expert before in any court proceedings?
Yes, I have.
Your Honors, under Rule of Evidence 702, legislative defendants tender Professor M.V. Trey Hood as an expert in American politics and policy with a specialization in Southern politics, election administration, racial politics, and electoral politics on the basis of his knowledge, skill, experience, training, and education.
Are there any objections to that tender?
No objection.
Your Honor.
He is so received. You may ask your next question.
Ms. Hardiman, if we could bring up JX39.
Could I make a statement quickly?
Certainly.
I wanted to say that if it's permissible, I have some hard copies of my reports in this matter in front of me. If it's not, I will put them away.
Well, Professor Hood, let me ask you, do you have any notations or markings on those reports?
No, I do not.
Hearing no objection, I'm going to say that's fine for you to do, and I believe that's been done by other experts in the case. So one request that I do have for you, Professor, is if you are referring to or looking at any particular part of your report, if you could let us know what page or paragraph you're on so that we can all follow along with you.
Certainly.
So Professor Hood, do you see the document that has been published up on the screen?
Yes.
And do you recognize this as the expert report that you submitted in December 14th, 2020 as your merits report in this case?
Yes.
Okay. And do you stand by the opinions that you offered in this report?
Yes.
Okay. And are there any corrections that you would like to make?
There are a couple of things I would like to note. One, let's see, paragraph 29, page 14, the last page before all the ancillary materials.
Okay.
Okay, so about midway through or down through the paragraphs there, I make the statement that South Carolina's law, which has been upheld as constitutional by the District Court of the District of Columbia. Technically, that needs to say the District Court of the District of Columbia upheld let me rephrase. South Carolina's voter ID law was not viewed or judged as being in violation of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, I think is a more correct way to state that.
Okay. Any other corrections or clarifications that you would like to make?
Let's see. Paragraph 14 on page 8. So on to the next page. Okay, so right at the top there, I put with this provision, no otherwise qualified elector will be denied the ability to cast a ballot in North Carolina because they lack requisite identification. I think it's more proper to say no one will be denied the ability to cast a ballot in North Carolina because they are unable to present identification. So it's a little more, that's a little more restrictive what I have there in terms of the way in which I understand the reasonable impediment declaration of SB 824 to be implemented would be a little more inclusive than what I have there. So an inability to present identification would probably be a better way to say that or state that.
Okay. And were there any other corrections that you wanted to make before we continue talking about your report?
I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay. So if we could turn Ms. Hardiman to paragraph 2 and Professor Hood of paragraph 2 of your report. Do you see that before you?
Yes.
Okay. Does this paragraph accurately reflect what you were asked to offer an opinion about in this case?
Yes, it does.
And can you tell us what were you asked to offer an opinion on?
Well, I was asked to look at SB 824 and make some or see if I could draw some conclusions about SB 824 and also compare SB 284 or 824, excuse me, to South Carolina's voter ID statute, which I had performed a study on previously, and to look at some questions in South Carolina because of the similarity of the laws in terms of whether or not overall turnout was in any way depressed, and second, whether there were any racial disparities in turnout that arose after South Carolina implemented its law.
Okay. And I am going to be asking you about some of those opinions here today, but before I get there, I want to show you one more report that you authored. Ms. Hardiman, if you could bring up what I believe is JX 784. And do you see that document on the screen, Professor Hood?
Yes, I do.
And do you recognize this document as the rebuttal affidavit that you submitted in this case in January of 2021?
Yes.
And is this a rebuttal report that you submitted in response to some points raised by plaintiff's expert, Professor Lillotis?
It is. It is.
And do you stand by the opinions that you offered in this report?
I do.
Okay. Are there any changes that you'd like to make to this report?
No.
And Your Honors, pursuant to the prior agreement of the parties, we move into evidence JX 39 and JX 784 as part of Professor Hood's direct testimony in this case.
All right, JX 79 and 784 are received.
So turning back to your merits report in this case, Professor Hood, I want to focus on the first issue that you were asked to analyze, the similarities between Senate Bill 824 and South Carolina's voter ID law. As an initial matter, why do you state in your report in paragraph 2 that Senate Bill 824 was modeled on South Carolina's law?
That statement is based on an analysis I did in terms of reading SB 824, the text of the bill, and comparing it to South Carolina's voter ID statute, which, if I remember correctly, is Act R54. I believe that's what they labeled it. So that statement is based on that comparison that I performed.
And what did that comparison cause you to conclude?
Well, my conclusion is that the South Carolina's voter ID statute and SB 824 are very similar, certainly overall very similar. One, they require someone or they ask someone to present government issued photo identification as part of the voting process. Second, both laws have in South Carolina, it's an affidavit. Technically, in North Carolina, it's a declaration that can be executed by a voter who doesn't have an ID. So a reasonable impediment affidavit or declaration are in both of these laws. Again, slightly different wording in terms of it's an affidavit in South Carolina and a declaration in North Carolina. So this would allow someone who might not have an ID to execute an affidavit, cast their ballot, and again, it doesn't require any other effort on the part of the voter in this case. In both states, the ballot would be converted to a regular ballot and counted unless the affidavit or declaration was viewed to be falsely sworn. So overall, certainly these laws are very similar. I mean, no two state laws are probably exactly alike, but these are very, very similar in my opinion.
And what is your familiarity with South Carolina's voter ID law based upon? Or maybe I could ask it a different way. Was your familiarity with South Carolina's voter ID law based on a study you did for the purposes of this case or prior work that you had done?
Both, actually. I was a testifying expert in South Carolina BUS, which was in the District Court of the District of Columbia. And so I learned a lot about Act R54 at that point, certainly. Now, it had not been implemented at that point. And after that, after the case, I was no longer a part of any kind of litigation, but just strictly as an academic research matter. Once the law was implemented in South Carolina, a colleague and myself executed a study to determine what the effects of the law were. So again, this is after implementation. And so both of those things sort of informed my knowledge of South Carolina's voter ID law.
Do both of the laws, both South Carolina's and North Carolina's voter ID laws, provide for the issuance of free voter ID voter IDs from either South Carolina's equivalent of North Carolina's county boards of election?
Yes, they do. So at the county level, of course, SB 824 has not been implemented, but if it were to be implemented at the county level in both North Carolina and South Carolina, a registrant could go and get a free ID for the purposes of complying with the voter ID law in that respective state. So the answer is yes.
And are there any ways in which the laws are different that are significant in your mind?
Well, let me state one thing about the free ID, and that is that in neither state does it require underlying documentation like a birth certificate. So name, date of birth, last four of your social security number is sufficient. And that's not the way it is in every state. Certainly in Wisconsin and Texas and Georgia, you would have to provide some kind of underlying proof of identity and proof of birth documentation, like a birth certificate, for instance.
Okay. I appreciate that clarification. So then focusing on any other significant differences, are there any of those that you felt were significant? And to point you to, if we could, Ms. Hardiman, could we pull up table 1 on page 6 of Professor Hood's December report, which is JX 39.
So one difference between SB 824 and Act R54, South Carolina's voter ID law, are the types of acceptable government issued photo identification which can be used in each state. Okay, there we go. So there's a comparison chart I drew up. So South Carolina's, I guess much more restrictive in terms of the mix of IDs that can be used. You can use a driver's license, a South Carolina driver's license, a state issued ID card, a passport, a military ID, or a free voter ID card in South Carolina. And those forms of identification need to be valid and unexpired. In North Carolina, North Carolina also includes those 5 forms of identification, plus some others. An out-of-state driver's license, if someone's moved and registered within the last 90 days, would be acceptable. An out-of-state ID card, if someone again has moved into North Carolina and registered within 90 days of the election. A public assistance ID card, a state or local government employee ID card, a university or college ID, a tribal ID, or a Veterans Affairs ID. So the mix of identification types allowed under SB 824 is more expansive in North Carolina than South Carolina's Act Art 54. So that's a difference between the 2 laws. They both require a government-issued photo identification, but the mix of photo identification is different.
Okay. For your report, did you consider or analyze whether South Carolina's experience with its voter ID law can tell us anything about Senate Bill 824's likely effect on voter turnout?
Well, I believe so. Again, if one considers that these 2 laws are very similar, we've studied the implementation of Act R54 in South Carolina. So from what we learned there, it's my opinion that those lessons can be applied to North Carolina and what might happen if SB 824 were implemented in North Carolina.
And I'm going to ask you some specific questions about your study of South Carolina's law. But before I do, let me ask you this. Why, in your expert opinion, did you conclude that South Carolina's experience with its voter ID law would be relevant to a different voter ID law in North Carolina?
Well, as we've talked about, the laws are not identical. I mean, I think very seldom are you going to ever find 2 state laws that are identical, but they're very, very, very similar, especially again with the reasonable impediment affidavit or declaration being in both laws is sort of a mitigating tool that can be used to allow someone that doesn't have an ID, a government issued photo ID, to go ahead and cast a ballot and have that counted.
Are there other points of similarity, setting aside the laws, are there other points of similarity between North Carolina and South Carolina that cause you to believe it's a fair comparison?
Well, I mean, outside of the law itself, both states are southern states. Obviously, they have a shared history. They both have very large minority populations, especially African-American populations. They're geographically contiguous to one another. So you can't get much closer geographically, literally. So they're, again, in terms of comparing 2 states on a particular law that is slightly different across the 2 states, I'm going to admit that. I think this is a pretty apt comparison.
So if we could turn now to Exhibit B of JX39, and I believe that's page 34, there you go, of the PDF. Do you see that document, Professor Hood?
Yes, I do.
And can you tell us what is this document?
This was a research article that I wrote, which we discussed previously just a few minutes ago, that examines the implementation of South Carolina's voter ID law and what the effects were.
And where was this article published?
It was published in a political science journal, sort of a general field journal known as Political Research Quarterly.
Is that a peer-reviewed journal?
Yes,
And was this article peer-reviewed?
yes.
And when was this article published?
Pretty recently. I think, you know, I'm not trying to dodge the question. It always comes out electronically now before the paper copy does. So I think it came out maybe electronically in 2019, if I'm remembering correctly.
And is this Political Research Quarterly, the journal that this article was published in, is that a journal that is routinely relied upon by experts in your field?
I would say so, yes.
And before conducting this study, did you have any hypotheses that you were attempting to test?
Well, there were a couple of hypotheses. So that's on page 494 of the article. I'm not exactly sure what page it is. It's the third page of the article at the top. Right there. Yes, thank you. So there are two hypotheses we were testing directly. You know, would there be generally, would there be a negative or dampening effect on turnout from the implementation of Act R54 overall? And second, we compared Black and white registrants in South Carolina and their turnout behavior before and after the law was implemented. And so the second question relates to the fact is there going to be, or was there a disparate racial impact related to the implementation of the law? So those are the two hypotheses we really sort of focused in on.
And am I correct in understanding that going into the study, your hypothesis was that the enactment of the voter ID statute would negatively affect turnout?
Yes, that's is stated in the affirmative. So again, when we get to the end of the research process, we can either, you know, accept the research hypothesis or reject it, right? But it is stated in the affirmative, yes.
Okay. And so similarly, your second hypothesis going into the study was that the enactment of South Carolina's voter ID law would affect at a greater rate Black registrants than white registrants.
Correct.
Okay. So staying on page 3 of that article, if we look under the heading Data and Method.
Correct, yes.
Okay, do you see that?
Yes.
All right. And it states there that to study the effects of South Carolina's voter ID statute, we need an identified group of registrants who lack proper photo ID and whose behavior we can observe across time. In addition, we also require a comparison group in which registrants possess ID. Why were those factors important?
Well, those factors are critical because one, you know, if someone has an ID, if they're in possession of a government issued ID that's, you know, applicable to the law under study, then they're not going to be affected by the law, obviously. So to really determine if there's going to be an effect in terms of a law like this, we've got to try to identify a group of registrants who we think lack government issued photo ID, because, you know, that's the group that's going to be potentially affected by the law. But we want to have a comparison group. So again, the comparison group would be those that do have a government issued photo ID. And we need multiple time points. We need a time point for both of those groups before implementation, so we can observe their behavior. And when I say behavior in this context, I'm talking about turnout. Did they turn out to vote or not? And then we need a time point after implementation where the law is going into effect. And so then we're going to gauge turnout again, or get a fix on turnout for these two groups again after implementation. So all of those factors really are critical in terms of the research design we used in this particular case.
And how did you determine that the individuals did not have voter ID that would be permissible under the law that you were studying?
So the South Carolina Elections Commission ran a list against their DMV database, ran a list of the registrants in South Carolina, and came up with a list of those who they thought, lacked government issued photo ID, a driver's license, or a state ID card. And that list was part of a public education campaign that the state of South Carolina was using to educate people about the changes coming about from the new law, and that was public record. So that's how we obtained that list.
Okay, let me stop you there for a moment and ask you a few questions about that list. In South Carolina, in order to generate that no match list, does the South Carolina Elections Committee and the DMV have complete social security numbers for the registered voters in South Carolina?
Yes.
Okay. And what does the existence of complete social security numbers for registered voters in both the registrant, the voter registration rolls and in the DMV data mean with respect to being able to create a no match list?
Well, it means there should be a one-to-one match. Having carried out this exercise quite a few times, not in this case, but in other cases in other states, matching exercises between databases are not always easy. So we have a unique identifier in the South Carolina DMV database, their social security number, and a unique identifier in the South Carolina Election Commission registrant database. So it should be pretty easy, and it is, to link those two databases together and determine which registrants don't have a valid driver's license or state ID card in South Carolina.
Were there any other types of IDs that you were able to incorporate, or I should say that the state was able to incorporate into that no match list besides the state issued IDs?
Not to my knowledge. Again, the list is sparse, I guess you could say, in South Carolina. There are only 5 forms anyway, but the answer is not to my knowledge. And again, this is, let me just say, this isn't something, these lists can't be produced just doing academic research. They require government agencies. And so outside of a court case, I can't carry out the matching exercise like this. So we were, making do with or utilizing the data that was produced by the state for their public education campaign.
Understood. And how did you determine if the individuals in this study that you were conducting did or did not cast votes in 2010 and 2014 in the 2 elections that you were?
Well, like most states, South Carolina has a validated voter history file. And so that's, again, publicly accessible. Not how someone voted, obviously, but whether they turned out to vote or not. And so we're not making a guess about that or making an estimate of that. This should be a pretty accurate read on who voted and who didn't vote based on those voter history files.
And why did you select those 2 years, 2010 and 2014?
Well, the law was the court case, South Carolina v. U.S. Was argued in the fall of 2012. So coming up to the election, the general election in November of 2012. And while the court allowed implementation to continue with the law, they did not allow it for the 2012 general election. So it was implemented starting in January of 2013. And so we compared the 2010 midterm election, which would be prior to implementation. The laws implemented in January 2013. And then we compared turnout in the 2014 general election, midterm general election on the other side of that. So the two elections on either side of the implementation of the law, the most proximate elections were, and almost in the middle actually, were the 2010 midterm and the 2014 midterm. So that's why we chose those elections.
And what were your study's findings with respect to voter turnout? Or put another way, what were your study's findings with respect to the two hypotheses that you were testing?
Well, the main analysis, I guess you could say, is in table 4 of the article. Perhaps we could page down a little bit.
Sure. And Ms. Hardiman, for your knowledge, that's page 7 of the internal number 7 of the article.
Okay, this is, I guess you would call this the primary analysis. I mean, there were other analyses we carried out. There were some analyses published in an appendix which came along with the article. But this is what's called a difference in difference test. And so this is very straightforward, and these are just percentages literally that we're looking at here. And so up at the top panel of the table where it says all registrants, that's where we're looking at overall turnout rates in 2010 and 2014, as you can see. And we have the turnout rates for those with ID and without ID. And from that, we can calculate a difference. So that's the intra-election difference. So in 2010, 56.4 minus 24.4 is 32. And again, these are just percentages, and now I'm just doing basic math here. In 2014, turnout's 48.8% for those that have ID versus 12.6% for those that don't have ID. So the intra-election difference there is 36.2. And then the difference of the difference between those two is negative 4.2. So again, if the intra-election gap between implementation of the law or after implementation of the law grows, so if the turnout gap between those with and without ID grows, then we would expect a negative number over there on the right, and that would indicate that turnout's been depressed by that percentage. So that's sort of how this works. And again, it's very simple and straightforward, but it is a powerful research design in that we have a before and after implementation time point, and we have two different groups that we're comparing, one with and without ID. And you can see that their turnout between these two groups varies widely even before implementation in 2010. And so no one should be affected in 2010. And let me just also state before I forget, how do we know who is a white or black registrant? Well, like North Carolina and South Carolina, these data are recorded by the state registrar's office. So that again, these aren't estimates. These are people that are registrants that have self-identified racially using these categories.
Okay. And so before we turn to the impact based on race, in terms of overall impact on voter turnout, did your study find that after the implementation of the South Carolina voter ID law, that there was an impact on overall voter turnout?
Yes, as again indicated over on the left-hand side by that negative sign in front of the difference in difference calculation. So yes.
And do you consider that difference, negative 4.2%, to be significant?
Well, if we want to use the term statistically significant, these are population data. You know, usually we use the term statistically significant or not where you're looking at sample data and making an inference back to a population. These are population data. So any different, I'm arguing it's significance testing is really not necessary. Any difference that we find one way or the other, it should be very close to the actual difference that occurred. So it is significant.
Okay. And now if you look at the impact on voter turnout on broken down by white registrants and black registrants, or white voters and black voters, what did you find?
So again, now we're just taking all registrants and dividing them up into these racial categories, these self-identified racial categories of white and black. And so going through the same exercise, for white registrants, the difference in difference measure is negative 4.6. So again, there's a depressive effect. For black registrants, the difference in difference measure is negative 4.3. Both groups are affected by implementation of the law. Whites are slightly more affected than black registrants, 4.6 versus 4.3.
So based on this, do you believe that your second hypothesis that we started with, was that proven to be true? Was it borne out?
Not based on these data, no.
And if you could, and so putting that, putting that in just plain English, what does that mean?
Using this test in table 4, the answer would be the second hypothesis not upheld or confirmed.
And in your expert experience and opinion, why is it important to do this kind of before and after study to assess the law's effect?
Well, again, we have to have a baseline on people's behavior before a law is implemented to understand how things may change after the law is implemented. And if we don't have that baseline, it's much, much harder to make or come close to making any kind of causal inference. Again, this research design we're talking about here, the difference in difference research design, comes closer, in my opinion, than many things we can do in the social sciences in terms of positing causality. So again, it's simple and straightforward, but yet very powerful.
Can we do this kind of an analysis here in North Carolina to determine the effects of Senate Bill 824 on voter turnout?
Well, we would only have the first part of this. The answer is no. I mean, we could run a list and figure out who we don't think has an ID currently. We can compare their voting behavior to those that do have an ID, who we think have an ID, say in the 2020 general. But we can't execute this kind of analysis unless SB 824 is actually implemented. And then we can study how that law affected things on the other side of implementation. So the short answer is no.
Okay. Given that you can't do this kind of analysis that would be, your preferable way to study the issue, were you nevertheless able to form an opinion as to whether what you found in South Carolina provides any guidance on what we're likely to expect here in North Carolina if Senate Bill 824 is allowed to go into effect?
Well, again, just restating what I've already talked about, given that the laws in South Carolina and the law that's currently enjoined in North Carolina are very similar, I would expect similar effects in terms of implementation.
Great. I would now like to pull up what we have pre-marked as LX4. Okay, could you please pull that article up? Trey, do you see this, Professor Hood, do you see this article that's on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, and what is this article?
It was another article that I wrote with a different colleague looking at the implementation of Georgia's voter ID statute which was put in place in 2007.
Okay. And when was this article published, approximately?
2012, it looks like.
Okay. And what journal was this article published in?
State Politics and Policy Quarterly.
Okay. And again, is that a peer-reviewed journal?
Yes.
And how did the Georgia law that you were studying in this article compare in terms of strict voter ID requirements to both North Carolina and South Carolina?
Well, the Georgia voter ID statute is different. It's what I would call a strict voter ID statute in terms of requiring someone who wants to vote to present government issued photo identification. And if they're unable to do so in Georgia, they would have to vote a provisional ballot, which could only be cured if they brought requisite identification to the county board before the votes were canvassed. So there's no sort of affidavit or declaration that one could use to go ahead and cast a ballot, which would be then converted to a regular ballot, as in the case of South Carolina and North Carolina. So it's stricter.
Did Georgia's law provide for free IDs issued by the county boards of election?
Yes, and still does.
So turning to internal page 409 of this article. Do you see well, I'm gonna wait till she gets there. Okay. Starting with the first full paragraph that starts with second. Do you see that paragraph?
Yes.
Okay. And it states, or you state, second, although the law does slightly depress overall turnout, this effect does not disproportionately affect racial or ethnic minority groups. Although the extent of the fall off in participation among those lacking necessary ID varied across racial ethnic groups, it affected all groups, including whites. In fact, white Georgians were actually the most likely to be affected by the new law. Does that accurately summarize one of the findings from this article?
Well, actually 2 findings, but yes.
Okay, thank you for that correction, 2 of the findings. And are the results of your analysis that you did on Georgia consistent with what you found for South Carolina?
Well, they weren't exactly the same, but they were consistent in terms of a small depressive effect overall on turnout after implementation. But racial or ethnic groups or registrants were not more affected than white registrants. So it's similar in that way, yes.
And given that Georgia does not have what in North Carolina we've been calling the reasonable impediment process, how does that impact, if at all, your opinion as to whether the findings in this Georgia study are comparable or translatable to what might we expect to see here in North Carolina?
Well, again, the South Carolina study is the most germane one in terms of North Carolina's SB 824. But, the Georgia law is even stricter. And there we didn't find, again, a racially disparate impact. So this is, I would say, more evidence that a racially disparate impact might not exist when or if North Carolina's law is implemented.
And Ms. Hardiman, you can take that down. Professor Hood, I'm going to turn now to the rebuttal report that you put in responding to plaintiff's expert, James Lolotis. First, I'd like to pull up, Ms. Hardiman, actually, if you could pull up JX 695, which is the expert report of Professor Lolotis. Do you see that expert report on the screen, Professor Hood?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And is this the expert report that you reviewed and responded to in part?
Yes.
Okay. If we could go to page 77 of Professor Lilotis's report. So in the second full paragraph on that page, and Ms. Hartman has that highlighted, do you see where it states a 2017 study published in the Journal of Politics offers compelling evidence that over time, voter photo ID laws will significantly restrict minority voters' participation in democratic governance?
Yes, I do.
Are you familiar with this 2017 study that Professor Lilotis cites here?
I am, yes.
Okay, and what is that study?
It's a study that was published in the Journal of Politics. I don't remember the exact title of it. I can look it up here.
If we can scroll down to footnote, I believe it's footnote 233. Is that the report that he is referring to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are the findings of this study, and I guess I'll call it the Zoltan study, are the findings of this study consistent with other peer-reviewed work on this topic?
There's generally no, it's somewhat of an outlier. Generally, if I were to characterize the state of academic research on voter ID laws, most studies have found only no effects or very slight effects. So this is making the case for very or much larger effects, and so it's not the only study that does so, but again, most studies are sort of on the other side of the fence on this. Really, either can't find a relationship at all, or it's just a very small effect.
And in terms of the voter ID laws that this study that Professor Lilotis cites, in terms of the voter ID laws that the study was looking at, were they consistent with the provisions of the voter ID law in North Carolina or in South Carolina?
No. Actually, what they were looking at in terms, or what that statement's based off of, were laws like the Georgia voter ID law, which again are what we would call strict voter identification laws, in which if you don't have requisite identification, you're forced to cast a provisional ballot, which is only going to get counted if you show up before the vote canvass and provide identification. So no, the answer is they're not the same sort of set of laws, if you will, or categories of voter ID laws.
Okay. If we could scroll back up to that same paragraph that we were looking at. Professor Lilotis has testified that this study finds that, quote, for Blacks, in general elections, the predicted participation gap relative to whites widens from 2.9 to 5.1 percentage points. And in primaries, it more than quintuples from 2.5 to 11.6 points. Do you agree with that representation of what this study finds?
Well, those are the numbers cited by the authors. That's true. But even the authors admit in the research study that, again, we're not certain whether or not there's really a difference in turnout based on these laws between non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. In other words, so the statistics do not bear this out. Just because you can produce a model and you can generate estimates doesn't mean that they're statistically significant. And I'll use that term in this case because they're relying on survey data to make these inferences. Again, I was relying on a different data set in the article that we looked at previously. And as well, another interesting point is that the data set they were using, the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, sometimes called the CCES, does not denote who has an ID and who doesn't have an ID. So they're just literally looking at overall turnout rates across these states, classifying states based on what type of voter ID law they have. And that's fine. But again, that's not a very powerful inference, knowing that typically most registrants have requisite voter identification already. So I'm saying there's an issue with that.
Now, Ms. Hardiman, if we could bring up what has been pre-marked as LX10. Okay. I'm showing you another article here, Professor Hood, that's entitled Obstacles to Estimating Voter ID Laws' Effect on Turnout. Are you familiar with this article?
Yes, I am.
And did you review this article in preparing your opinions and reports in this case?
I did.
Okay. And is this article published in the same academic journal that published the study that Professor Lolotis cites in his report that we were just discussing?
It does. It was also published in the Journal of Politics, which is the same publication.
Okay. And other than the obvious from the title, what does this article analyze?
Well, it's a, I guess in legal terms, we would say it's a rebuttal or it's a response. We usually call it in the social sciences to the Zoltan article. So they wrote this article after the first article we just talked about was published.
Okay. So if we could scroll down to page 1050, and that's the internal numbering on this article. In the left-hand column in the second full paragraph, do you see where the author writes, in no specification do we find that primary or general turnout significantly declined between 2010 and 2014 among Hispanics or Blacks in states that implemented a strict voter ID law in the interim, and in many the point estimate is positive.
Yes, I see that.
What does it mean that the point estimate was positive?
Well, in this case, it may be, I'd have to look at the tables to see if it was statistically significant or not, but it's saying the coefficient had a positive point estimate, meaning, and actually turnout would have gone up after implementation of a strict voter ID law, not down. There would be a negative sign if it had gone down or was depressed.
And does the fact that there was a positive impact on Hispanic and Black voter turnout in states that had implemented a strict voter ID law, does that contradict the findings relied upon by Professor Lolotis?
Well, again, to be absolutely detailed about this, I'd have to look to see if those positive estimates were statistically significant. If they're not, if they're just positive but insignificant, it would be no effect. So there either was no effect on Black and Hispanic turnout after implementation of a strict voter ID law, or there was actually a positive effect. So it's, could be one or the other. They did quite a few model specifications, as I remember.
Whether there was no impact or there was a positive impact, that would be different than there being a negative impact, as suggested by Professor Lolotis, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. There, no impact or positive is certainly different from negative.
Let me stop you right there if I can. It's now about 4:55, and we can resume Professor Hood's testimony perhaps at some point tomorrow. Just want to go over a couple things here before we break for the day. First of all, our schedule tomorrow, if you'll recall, will be 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Set that up for Fridays. And I know we missed a day of court basically earlier in the week, but folks have already made plans, I think, for a Friday afternoon based on that pre-announced schedule. So we're going to stick with that schedule for tomorrow. So remember, instead of beginning at 9:30 on Friday, we will begin at 9 o'clock a.m. We'll have the courtroom open a little before that so that we can start right at 9 a.m. Then generally tomorrow we'll take 2 breaks, and then we'll work sort of through lunch and stop at 1 p.m. Now, Ms. Riggs, I believe that you said Mr. Ford would be available to be back on Friday. Are you prepared to have him back here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.?
That was the last we heard. The representation from Ms. Moss was that Mr. Ford would be available tomorrow morning, and so we would plan to resume his examination, although I think he was speaking with Mr. Patterson when we left off.
But yes, Your Honor, he will be here at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Okay. Then we'll start back fresh with him at 9 a.m. Tomorrow morning. Just look through. We did stop during his cross-examination by Mr. Pete Patterson. So that's where we'll start back with him tomorrow at 9 a.m. And then obviously the case at that point would, I guess you'd say, sort of return to the plaintiffs and allow you all to put in any exhibits that you want, and then perhaps to that.
Right, Your Honor, you broke up after allow you all to put in any exhibits that you want, and then.
I think I said perhaps to rest your case after that. So we'll go from there. But I guess this witness, Professor Hood, might be on standby. Mr. Patterson, you don't know how long you still have with Mr. Ford, do you?
Let's see, my video is still buffering there. I'm not certain, Your Honor. You know, it's hard to give an estimate. If I had to guess, I would say, you know, less than an hour, but it's really hard to say.
I won't hold you to it. All right. So are there anything else that we need to take up prior to recessing for the day?
Not for your plaintiffs, Your Honor.
Not for the legislative defendants, Your Honor.
Yes.
Okay, great. Then we'll be in recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Hope that you all have a good evening, and we'll see you back here then.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor.